person that has ever lived. So Ecclesiastes 1:9, Solomon writes, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun." In our generation, we tend to think, we talk about like the New Age, right? These New Age religions and stuff. But if you really examine them, they actually go back to ancient times. They're just repackaged, right? But they always wind up having the same beliefs, and they deny the deity of Christ. But they're really, even as you look at history, there's that saying that history repeats itself. Well, there's a reason to that, because as God says here, there's nothing new under the sun. Man is still man. We just have new technology, and our culture changes a little bit, but people still have the same inherent sin problems and the same issues, whatever generation it is. Well, I bring that up because when we talk about prophecy, a lot of times you're going to see recurring themes. It's like, well, this is happening now, but that looks very similar to something that happened in the past, and that's meant to be. And I've mentioned this before in a lot of other sermons, that God uses types and foreshadowings. Just to give you a quick example, Joseph in the Old Testament would be a type of Christ. He's not God, he's not the Messiah, but when you look at his life, right, he had a coat that was valuable that his father gave him. Well, Jesus, believe it or not, had a really nice robe that at the cross they didn't want to split, so they gambled for it, right, because it was worth something. Joseph was thrown into a well. Jesus was put in the earth and then rose from the dead. Joseph was taken out of the well and rose. If you look at the similarities between Joseph and Jesus, I think there's something like 25 types. And then you have foreshadowings, where something happens in the past because God's trying to show us something that's going to happen in the future. An example of that would be during the intertestamental period, when the Jews were occupied by the Assyrians. We had this guy Antiochus who comes in and he destroys a lot of the cities in Israel. He takes over the temple and he sets up an image that has to be worshipped in the temple. Well, there's something that's going to happen in the future in the book of Revelations. We hear about the Antichrist doing the same exact thing. These are not coincidences. God not only gives us his written word, but he gives us all these type of examples so that we should be going, duh, this is what God's trying to show us. It's a word picture, basically. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I'm going to give you, like I said, 3 examples. Whoops. Went a little too far there. So the first example, I was thinking about this. I had given a sermon talking about the red heifers. And I looked back at my notes, and to me it seemed like I gave that sermon 6 months ago, but I realized it's been September 2022 when I gave that sermon. I'm like, boy, the time is just really zipping by fast. And so this is kind of an update on where things are at with the red heifers. If you don't know anything about this, you can read in Numbers chapter 19 in the Old Testament. This is where God gives all of those instructions for Old Testament worship. And at the time he gave this instruction, there wasn't a temple. They had the tabernacle, right? The tent with all of the fixtures that could be picked up and carried. And this is, God gave them elaborate ceremonies that they had to fulfill, and this is one of them. And some of the highlights I put here, the purpose of the sacrifice. And I know that you can read this or you have your notes, but there are people listening online or are going to watch this, so that's why I'm going to repeat some of this. So the purpose of the sacrifice was to create a mixture of the ashes with water that would be used to sprinkle on the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and later on the first and second temples, as well as if a person or a priest had become impure from touching a dead body or for stepping on a grave, they had to be ritually pure in order to worship in the temple. So that was one of the reasons that God had this. The sacrifice must occur outside the camp. So we know that whether it was the tabernacle or when the temples were built, the sacrifices would be in the outer court right there. But in this case, this sacrifice has to take place off of the temple grounds. The temple grounds are like 30 acres of land if you were to include it all together. So so what is that a symbol of? Well, Jesus was crucified outside the camp, right? It specifically says that in the Gospels, that he was sacrificed outside. So that's kind of one of those foreshadowings. During the time of the first and second temples, the sacrifice would be on the Mount of Olives. So, I've been to Israel, so this helps me to kind of, get a mental picture of this. You have the wall that goes around Old Jerusalem. You have the Temple Mount area. And today we have the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? There is no temple right now. And on the eastern side of this, you have different gates that come out of these walls. You have the gate that leads to Damascus. It's called the Damascus Gate. You have the Jaffa Gate that leads to Jaffa. And then on the eastern side, you have the Eastern Gate, or the Beautiful Gate, or the Golden Gate. And if you were to come out of that gate, you would walk down the Kidron Valley and up the Mount of Olives. So the Mount of Olives is on the east facing Jerusalem. That gate has been sealed up for the last 500 years. There was a Muslim ruler who heard about these prophecies that the Messiah would walk through that gate, and he sealed it up because he was trying to stop Messiah from coming through there. Well, if you are into prophecy, you can read Zechariah chapter 12 through 14, and it talks about the Messiah returning and walking through that gate. So the gate will be opened, and it does say there will be an earthquake at that time. Buried right in front of that gate are all these Muslim graves they buried because they know a Jewish person can't step over a grave or else they'll be ceremonially unclean. Just a little side information there. So for the Jews to build their third temple, and if you pay attention to these things, this is an active conversation in Israel that the Jewish people are having. They're saying, wait a second, this Temple Mount belongs to us. This is part of ancient Israel. We own it. We need to have our third temple. God wants that kind of worship, and he wants us to rebuild the third temple. So there have been, for decades now, active workings creating all of the temple instruments, all of these things to get ready. They've even appointed a Sanhedrin. They have 70 Jewish priests that are appointed. They've been practicing all of the ceremonies and getting ready for this event. But they need the ashes of a pure red heifer. And again, I encourage you during the week, if you can read Numbers chapter 19. I don't have time to do that right now. Next point, there's only been 9 red heifers in all of history. Right, when they would do the purification, they would only need a little bit of the ashes mixed with the water and the hyssop and all of that. So in all of human history, and they keep track of this, there's only been 9 red heifers. And the rabbis believe the 10th red heifer will be the final red heifer, and that will be at the time of the Messiah, when the Messiah comes. So they're actively looking to do this now because in order to have the temple, they're going to have to purify it with the ashes of a red heifer, because it's kind of like the chicken before the cart, or the horse before the cart. Chicken in a cart. That would be a small cart, wouldn't it? So I just want to reiterate, though, as Christians, we are not looking forward to animal sacrifices, that somehow we're going to please God or be part of these ceremonies, because we know that Jesus Christ was the final and ultimate sacrifice, right? Almost 40 years, 38 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, the temple sacrifices stopped because the temple was destroyed, and there hasn't been temple sacrifices or animal sacrifices for 2,000 years. But the Jews, in order to fulfill prophecy, and that's the part as Christians that we're looking at, we want Jesus to return, and they want the Messiah to come for the first time. They're actively looking at this. We should be excited when we see it, not again because we're going to participate in those sacrifices, but because we know that this is leading up to